So we plan to always kind of backtrack a little and then layer in. So we're repeating some material from last year, but we're hoping that it's different enough to still be engaging for people who heard it last year. And that new people won't feel behind. You know, it's just like come as you are and jump in. And we'll just go on from there. So tonight we wanted to give an overview of what we plan to be covering.
Yeah, what you'll see is the syllabus shows 10 subjects, but the subjects take different amounts of time. So tonight we really won't even finish the overview of what we're going to try and cover in this class. But also, we simply want to stress that things we present here, they're speculations. We think they're well grounded, but they're still speculations, if you will, and then hypotheses or working ideas about what's going on or various assertions. But you know, it is what it is. We will try and cover the waterfront. So here we go with, I'm just going to make this a little bigger here. So you want to do this.
Okay, so as we were just saying, so what we do is we present usually like this, a PowerPoint deck during the class, and then we kind of ad lib on top of it. And then after the class, we send out an attachment of the deck and a video of the discussion. So some people only participate in that way. You know, they don't interact directly with us and ask questions or make comments, and that's fine. We don't make them public, but we do make them available to students that, you know, we're working with. Some people have never come to a class, some come to one or two, but then they continue in that kind of independent study. So it's all fine, it's all good. But you don't have to take notes or, you know, memorize what we're saying, because you will get a copy of it maybe tomorrow, either late tonight or tomorrow. And then we kind of always layer back a little when we're moving on. So there's a lot of review, but we try to make it different. And this is just a survey class, and there aren't any tests. So just let it sink in as it comes. And feel free to ask questions or make comments as we're going. Judith?
Can you define none? Is that strictly, because I say none, but I'm studying all of the religions. Right now I'm on Zoroastrianism, but is it that they don't associate themselves with a particular religion, or they don't associate with any?
Yeah, they don't associate with any, but you know, for example, we touched on J.D. Vance and his hillbilly elegy, and his parents were, they would say that they're very religious, but I don't think they ever went to church, any organized church whatsoever. But they felt they were religious.
Right.
The second thing behind their belief in God, if you will, the second thing was always the United States of America. That was what they believed in. So it's simply something that comes out of polls that are done by different outfits over the decades, and that's what they've observed.
I'll add something that I just read this past week that I found rather interesting. And if I got it correct, I believe that it said that all of the major, in the polls, all of the major religions have lost people in terms of the number of people who say that they identify as that religion, with the exception of evangelicals. The evangelicals have been increasing, and they say the reason is that Republicans in general conflate being Republicans and being evangelical, and that even though a significant percentage of Republicans never go to church or do anything religious in nature, a significant portion of them still in the polls self-identify as evangelical. However that skews this kind of the numbers associated with this, I don't know, but it definitely skews it. The point being that politics is now taking over for a lot of people what religion used to be.
Mm.
So just to be clear, this is true in the United States, but not necessarily in the rest of the world.
That's correct. It's not. For example, Islam is still very rapidly growing outside the United States. It's growing in the United States. But
As I would imagine, Roman Catholicism is still growing.
yeah, yes, Catholicism is still the single largest faith group in the world, over 2 billion people. So,
And as we're saying, you can be deeply religious, but just not affiliated.
yeah,
Even Unitarians, a lot of people kind of self-identify as Unitarian, but they're not part of any congregation.
want to go?
So,
Understood.
so spirituality, we feel, for better or for worse, we're not pro or con. This is just a starting place for us. Spirituality is becoming equally insignificant, with materialism ascendant and more people questioning the meaning of life. That's something we'd like to address.
Now, the United States, when the original English colonies, remember, many of them were settled by people that came here because they were persecuted for the religions they were pursuing in Europe. And so religion and spirituality was an integral part of their just daily life. First thing they would do is build a church.
And it was political as well. That's
Yeah.
where they voted. It was the town hall as well as
right.
the local church.
And after the American Revolution in the 1810, 1820, 1830, there was what was called a second awakening of religion in the United States. So there was a huge growth in churches everywhere, and just simply in seeing which church had which minister preaching at it that particular Sunday. The sermons were all printed in the newspapers and circulated. There wasn't any TV or anything, and people discussed the sermons in the public houses and the taverns, and it was just a huge part of life right up to the Civil War, when it all came to a screeching halt. If you read in the book of Matthew in the New Testament, Matthew says that Jesus of Nazareth said that there's God and there's money. If you become close to one, then you grow away from the other. And I think if you look at the headlines we're seeing every day, the money or materialism side is really far more ascendant, and there's hardly any discussion in the press of anything that's meaningfully spiritual or deals with the meaning of life.
I
Okay.
think that's sad.
Yeah.
So on the other hand, after 500 years, Western science has realized it has studied approximately 5% of the universe, with the remainder called dark.
Yeah, this is not a minor screw up. This is a biggie. And rest assured that the best and brightest are racking their brains for how in the world they could come up with theories or with tests, experiments, instruments, whatever, that would show them what the stuff is that they missed. We will give you some ideas on what we think it is. You can judge for yourself.
Well, this reminds me of the geneticists, the early geneticists, just sort of decided that, I don't remember the percentage, but a large percentage
Over 90%.
of the DNA in our bodies and animals' bodies was what they called junk code. Because they, figured it didn't do anything. It was just there. It was just that they didn't understand it yet. And now I don't think they think any of it is just junk code. So science has its own arrogance and its own issues as well in our minds. And just FYI, Bart is a trained mathematician and has worked as a physicist in a high-tech communications field with lasers and what else would you like to say?
Nothing.
So then our theme question is mysticism at the intersection of science, art, and religion?
So what we're going to try and cover here from broad brush is we're going to start off with mysticism and science. We'll go into the science side, but as you'll see, science doesn't have all the answers. We just gave you one example of that, of only studying 5% of the universe. The role of clairvoyance in observing the universe. The Kabbalah, which is in Judaism, we have the Torah, which would be called the first five books of the Old Testament, the Talmud, which is the interpretation of the Torah, and the Kabbalah, which is the most mystical side of Judaism, and in fact raises the notion of souls, and that the souls live forever, but bodies come and go, and the souls are reincarnated with the body. And we'll deal with topics in physics and theoretical physics that has a particular thing called string theory, where you view everything as vibrating strings. And we'll see, what that is.
Is there any part of Kabbalah that is taught as just a pedestrian part of Judaism?
Well, we did post on the resource side of Aleph Talks a little introduction to Kabbalah. So you can get that. It's a short thing, and it'll give you the quickie.
Now, I guess my question is more: is Kabbalah relative to Judaism an elitist component, or is there any part of Kabbalah that is just part of general Judaism?
Well, the Jews would say that it does permeate all of Judaism, but for the most part, it's esoteric. So the average Jewish person growing up isn't learning Kabbalah, but it's embedded in, say, the Torah. A lot of what we've, if you think about it for 5 minutes, it doesn't make sense. And that is because a lot of the principles that are being illustrated are actually esoteric principles about creation. And that's behind the creation story that's told in, the first book.
Are you saying the Kabbalah doesn't make sense? I missed that point.
I don't think the scripture makes sense. I don't think
Scripture. Okay.
the stories make sense without knowing the symbolism that's being represented. So it's not necessarily elite, but it is esoteric. And it is, like
It's
advanced training.
also,
You're, Judith, wait, make sure you're muted unless you're going to talk.
it's also reserved for,
We're having a lot of trouble
Judith,
hearing you.
Judith, mute yourself.
What-
Just,
What I learned was in Judaism, you couldn't study the Kabbalah until you were 40 and you had learned X amount of knowledge. And then you could study the Kabbalah because they felt that, what I was told, that younger people would be too enthused, just, oh, I'm going to try this, and then I'm getting into trouble. Now, whether that's, but that's, I was told they couldn't study until after they were 40 years of age and knew the Bible or the Old Testament or whatever they were teaching in school very well.
You could also only be male and you had to be married.
Okay.
But those rules aren't so strict anymore at this point. There are a
Marjorie,
lot of situations where women can learn and
yeah, Judith, mute yourself so Ad can come in. I think he's getting an echo. Ad, go
he's
ahead.
trying to say something.
yeah, no, I just always understood it. To answer Stephen's question, or Bruce's question, it was about kind of the equivalent of the high priest. The high rabbis would be able to understand, have so much depth of knowledge that they could then get more informed about the Kabbalah and Tree of Life than others. But that was just my understanding.
Yeah, the reality is that in the time of Jesus of Nazareth, you had the Pharisees and you had the Sadducees, and then you had the Essenes, and Jesus of Nazareth was a Nazarene, which is a particular piece of the Essenes. It's funny, they named the tribe Nazarene, and then since they had this town of Nazareth, people thought that was where he came from. It had no relationship whatsoever to it. But the Kabbalah side of things evolved out of the mystical side. The Essenes were the most mystical of all of them.
So for some people, it was a daily way of life, like the Essenes. For most people, it was advanced study. And as we said, it was reserved for men. I've heard an interpretation that the feeling was that women didn't need it, meaning that they were already, kind of there. But I think that's not necessarily true. Nowadays, the people who really kind of carry the lineage in the purest way from the ancient teachings are the Hasidim. And they're very different from mainstream Judaism. And for example, they don't agree with Israel. There are Hasidim in Israel, but they believe that, from what I understand, like the ones in New York believe that they should wait until the temple is resurrected by God and not go in and resurrect it. But they live, you can really feel it if you're in their presence. They live a mystical lifestyle every single day of the week. And the men basically pray and practice all day, and the women work and run the businesses. In this one community in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, that's where my teacher studied. And he taught at the Theosophical Society, which is a kind of esoteric society, but there is so-called Christian Kabbalah as well. And that had a lot to do with early alchemy in Europe and here. So
the other thing to keep in mind is there was a whole Renaissance period, and Kabbalah had some amazing mystics then, and they had a lot of writings. It appears that those writings were foretelling string theory, modern physics string theory. And we'll get into that toward the end. So one of the problems is they simply didn't have the framework or the language
Right.
that modern physics provides, but they were seeing things, and if you step back and look at it, you'd say, Mike, they were really seeing fundamental subnuclear particles, and yet how are they doing this?
When I was in classes, sometimes I took 4 classes a week. It took us a year to get through the alphabet, just all the, the symbolism of the Hebrew alphabet. And there were 4 parallel subjects going on at the same time. My teacher came from a background of esoteric Kabbalah, which is so-called Western, but he was also being mentored in Brooklyn by a rabbi teaching real Jewish Kabbalah. And they kind of made an exception for him. He was born Jewish, but not raised Jewish. He had never been bar mitzvahed. So they had an informal bar mitzvah. They chased him around a room and, blessed him before they would really start teaching him when he was working with this group of rabbis. And they sent him off to this one Hasidic man out in Brooklyn. And he had also had some Buddhist training and Western alchemy. So he was an artist. He was absolutely brilliant, but a really kind of a difficult person. I'll just say that. But I always felt that it was spiritual physics. And I would say that in class, and he said, yes, you're absolutely right. And there are people really focused on that in Israel. And hopefully they're not just working on building more bombs.
Marjorie, I have 2 questions for you. The first is, what's the distinction between what you're calling esoteric Kabbalah and Jewish Kabbalah? And the second question is, I was trying to grasp something you said a few minutes ago, and I'll put it in a different context. Other than fundamentalists, people largely view the Bible as a metaphor, as opposed to the fundamentalists who look at it as the literal word of God. It sounded to me like you were saying that your pedestrian general Judaism is more fundamental, but Kabbalah, a Kabbalah perspective would look at it more as metaphor. Did I catch that correctly, or?
Yes, that's true. Yes. Yeah, they see it as symbolic of Kabbalistic principles. And there's a lot in there that doesn't make any sense unless you understand the tree of life and what that represents. And it's impossible to take it literally. And also the stories will, like, for example, Adam and Eve are said to be the first people, but then after, I never remember, Cain slew Abel, I think. The one that did the slaying had a mark on his forehead to inform all the other people that he had committed this sin. Well, who are those other people? If the only men and women were, if the only man and woman on the planet were his parents, where did these other people come from? They weren't his cousins. Nothing is said about that. How could that be? But that's because it's a different layer. It's a different level of the Kabbalah that's being talked about. So it's impossible to take it literally if you pay attention. There's too many contradictions. But it's often that the Kabbalah is really like very diagrammatic. It's like a diagrammatic code to the Bible, so that things like that aren't conflicts. You understand they're talking about one level here and another level there, and it's not a contradiction. It's like a later stage.
I would also pick up on Judah's comment that I've talked to Jews from other parts of the world like the Ukraine or this Russia or Azerbaijan, and they're all into Kabbalah, and they're not even 40 years old. And it varies from where you go.
And I think as we've gotten closer to this era, there's been a real impulse to kind of put the information out there, to make it available on the internet and so on. Whereas before it was very closely guarded and you had to be initiated into it and all that. But I think even within that community, there's more of an urgency, an impulse to make it available because times are getting so dark,
Right.
I-
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to share that there was an Orthodox Jewish fellow that I would very regularly engage in all kinds of conversation, including conversations about religion. And I just posed to him the simple question of how does he reconcile things like evolution and dinosaurs with the world being whatever it is, 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And he said, basically he said, well, there is an explanation for that. My brother, who, is much more articulate on these matters, you could talk to him, he'd explain it to you how it all makes sense. I can't do that. But in his mind, there was no issue reconciling the fundamental viewpoint of the world being but some thousands years old with all of the physical evidence to the contrary. And I just find it really interesting that when I'm talking to thoughtful, well-educated people about matters like this, that there's no issue whatsoever in taking this literal leap of faith and connecting these things, even though they don't have any ability to articulate it. They believe that others could articulate it, and that's good enough for them.
Right.
Right.
Well, they might have had it articulated, but just not remember. But the teaching that I was given is that if you pay careful attention, in the beginning, there was no year. What is a year? A year is one revolution of the earth around the sun, or it looks like the sun is moving 360 degrees. The idea of a degree comes from our idea of a day, and vice versa, time and space. There was no year at the time that God was creating the solar system. And it also does seem to talk about evolution. The fishes crawl onto the land at some point. So if you kind of squint one eye and look at it the right way, you can see the story of the creation of the universe. It's something like the Big Bang or the Big Bounce, at the beginning. And then, and it's also thought that this creation story actually predates Judaism and was shared among a lot of tribes in the area, but they can be reconciled. But it's again, what is a year? That's a symbolic idea.
But Marjorie, that would mean that the definition of a year now, as the revolution around the sun equals a year, that would mean that, okay, of the 5,000 some odd years that since the world was created, certain of those years in the beginning, one quote year was equal to our notion of a billion years.
Correct.
But at some point it changed to a revolution around the sun.
Right.
So I think you would have had to come up with some delineation there as to when that would have happened. I mean, it's a very convenient, way to reconcile that, but there is no consistency.
But
We're
also you're looking
consistent.
at multiple translations and translations of translations. And in the original Hebrew, it isn't that fixed or linear. It's, you know, and you could be talking about an eon when you're talking about a year. As I said, the whole notion of a year didn't exist at that time. So it's like you're using it as a figure of speech.
Right.
Judith, what do you want to, go ahead.
Well, what they had put it down to a year, the church, but they said it was a period. A certain, as you said, it could be an eon, it could have been millions of years. 6 periods, we don't know how long it was. You know, everybody puts a different bend on it.
Right.
The church just put it down as years.
Right.
Yeah, if you look in the Torah or in again the Old Testament, the book of Genesis is very different than all the
Yeah,
books that
it's
follow it.
completely
There's something
different flavor.
there's some totally different thing going on there, and from what Moses wrote. So I'm gonna plug ahead here. We are going to deal with Eastern spirituality, which we've just touched on, meaning Buddhism. We deal with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Hinduism, Taoism. All of these things are very vital Eastern spiritualities. Zen Buddhism, which is, I think, much more in Japan, and so forth. And then Western esotericism, which we've been touching on here. I would say, you know, the Kabbalah is an example of Western esotericism. Schism. We touched on Helena Petrovna Blavatsky with the Theosophy Society. And that was an attempt to bring Eastern spirituality into the Western part of the world. So that by itself is very esoteric. You know, things like the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, or things that Joseph Campbell talked about with the myths and the archetypes that were there. And we're going to pick up on the missing women. Don't worry, we didn't forget that. We've got a section on transcendentalism and mysticism. So this is really an American side of things. We're dealing with Emerson and Thoreau. We're dealing with Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And so they use both prose, but Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson use poetry to show you their notions of transcendentalism. And there would all be, well, most people point as them being tied to the Unitarian movement.
They're kind of the Unitarian mystics.
Yes. Another example, by the way, I missed on Western esotericism is astrology, which shows up in different ways, or alchemy, which is really a search for perfection, looking for God in its own way. We're going to go back into the science and deal much more with astronomy and cosmology and astrology. So we're going to argue that there really wasn't a big bang. First, it was never big, and there was no bang because no one was around to hear anything go. So forget that, but it's a nice term, very catchy. But there was a big bounce, and we'll see what that leads to. And then in astrology, we have the notion of the planets influencing daily life for people here on Earth. And that suggests that these planets have archetypes. So there's a Gaia for Earth, and similarly for each of the other major planets. So we'll run through that. We've had in the past, for example, we have a painting on the website, which is an abstraction of the tree of life from the Kabbalah by a painter. And so we'll see if they're available to do a reprise and discuss, you know, their notion of mysticism, but they take it out in terms of painting or music in particular. Music, many people find very uplifting, and they find certain types of music almost mystical, that you're enraptured, or you stare at a sculpture, or you get caught up in dancing and you're just carried away, or you're into poetry. Someone like Maria Rainer Rilke, who arguably is a great mystic. So these are all things that we'll touch on. And then we'll spend time on Carl Gustav Jung and his notion of Gnosticism. And in particular, there was a dialogue he carried out with a theoretical physicist, Wolfgang Pauli. So Jung and Pauli traded 80 odd letters from over 27 years. And this led to some interactions with Pauli saying that physics is now doing things that we have no words for, and Jung learning enough physics to try and provide him with a vocabulary for what in the world they might see what is going on there.
And there, I would say there are terms for it in Kabbalah. If you learn the language of Kabbalah, a lot of it is the language of physics.
Right. This is you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about two schools of thought. That one is that there's a single underlying unifying entity that has created all and that governs its creation, that asks for us to love it and to love one another. And then another approach or point of view is that there's an individual or group of individuals that desire to teach others about this unifying entity, each group distinct from the other. So we would say Christianity and its sects, Islam and its sects, which include the Sufis, for example, Hinduism and its sects, Buddhism and its sects, Judaism and its sects, which we could lump, the Kabbalists in there, Unitarian Universalism and its sects. Unitarian Universalism is, for the most part, considered to be kind of post-Christian. They don't see Jesus Christ as God incarnate, as the only incarnation of God. They see like everyone is an incarnation. And he was like a special prophet or teacher, but not a unique. I would say, and I'm Unitarian, that he was more like an avatar, which is an embodiment of the divine in human form, that incarnated really for the purpose of teaching and healing us, and then that's why he came.
Now we're going to just touch here on Andrew Harvey's works. He argues that even in the highest and final stages of mystical illumination, there's a crucial gap that still remains between the creator and the creature, and necessitates a continuing practice of prayer, contemplation, and service. So enlightenment is not in any sense a static state of omniscience or oneness with being, as the Eastern religions have tended to represent it, but it's a continually opening up to an evolution in love. Bruce, do you have any comment on this? You're just on mute. Bruce, you're okay.
That sort of fits in. When But in Buddhism, there's a whole esoteric understanding of the mind that changes a whole lot of things. I mean, the idea of universal love is close to my experience. But in terms of understanding Buddhism, it's more about understanding the mind.
Mhm. But I thought that you said repeatedly that you see that all of this evolving, that it gets deeper and.
Oh, absolutely. It's there's deeper levels of the mind and reality that are changing all the time and evolving. Yeah, for sure.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
So what Andrew Harvey then argues is that the price for this growth and expansion and love is a heroic embrace of the laws of suffering and ordeal, as exemplified by Jesus of Nazareth. And to accept the demands of love is to accept the cross and the extreme suffering that comes with it.
But the Buddha said that life
Yeah.
is suffering.
Now, the Buddha says, I either bring you suffering or no suffering. Which one do you want? So no mystical training is authentic unless it results in a total commitment to other people, other beings, and to the service of justice and compassion in all forms in the creation. So
What exactly is meant by accepting the cross and all the suffering that goes with it? I mean, I understand there's a lot of suffering with crucifixion. Is it just a matter of trying to empathize with crucifixion? Is that the point?
Esoterically, the teaching is that the cross represents time and space. The horizontal bar is space and the vertical bar is time, and that we are all crucified. And when we take form in time and space, because we're separated from the oneness. So it's the human condition that the archetype of Jesus represents for us. He personifies it, makes it a historical story, but it's supposed to be really the whole human condition, because we're limited from the infinite oneness when we take body, when we embody.
you also remember that Moses wrote these 5 books that go into the Old Testament, and in particular, that's where the Jewish people are having a covenant with Yahweh, with God, and they're the chosen people. When Jesus of Nazareth died in that time period, he said that you'll be seeing the end of that first covenant, and that will be when the temple's destroyed. And the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Romans leveled the whole place. But he said that I will die for you, and this will be the start of the second covenant, but it will not be simply for the Jews. It'll be for all people everywhere in all ages.
We should have given a little bit of introduction to who Andrew Harvey is.
Do you want to do it?
Well, just pardon me, just a last little bit of clarification. So is the death of Jesus and bringing on this second phase, as you will,
The second covenant.
second covenant, is the crucifixion the essential component that they're looking to relate to, or is it the fact that Jesus was willing to die to move into the second covenant? I'm just confused about accepting the cross. I'm trying to figure out exactly what that means.
I think that the a really deep question that can go on and on, that it can be answered on many different levels. And I guess
I just to interject, and apologies to anybody that doesn't like to listen to me, but it's the opportunity for rebirth. It's to bring it. So Christ brought forward purity and was crucified for that purity, but was able to be reborn because he suffered the cross. So as an individual, if you are able to have as a goal purity and you are crucified for it, you can recognize that there's an opportunity for rebirth as a more pure being. That's my thought.
I like that. That
Yeah.
resonates for me.
Yeah.
And how does anybody else feel about
Yeah,
that?
I mean, remember the people that Jesus of Nazareth is preaching to are really the 99%. These are the downtrodden people. And he's promising them, if you have faith in me, if you love me, love yourself, you love your neighbors yourself, and you have faith in what I'm telling you, then there's the chance for you to enjoy an incredible reward by going through all this. And that was really a pretty powerful message for people that are just trying to scrape through, and the life expectancy is age 30, or all these people dying at birth and on and on. So he had a willing audience. Do you want to say anything about who Andrew Harvey is? He's written many books, and there's YouTube videos without any problem you can find. But I would say the main thing is that he came up with this notion of what is called sacred activism. You wanna?
But he grew up in India, but was raised Christian. And now I would say he's kind of transcended that. But he still uses a lot of Christian metaphors and language. He's based in New York at this point. And it'll speak for itself what he is putting out there as sacred activism, which is a term that he went to the trouble to trademark. It's really what I try to honor his commitment and teachings with the labyrinth work that we do. So the walk that we did in June was, my intention was for it to be an act of sacred activism for the earth. And the thing that earthed it was we had representatives there from, I think, 4 different sponsors of Earth Center groups in the area. And they contributed a composter to the church and made their work available. They had flyers and handouts and could answer questions and so on. And they all teach about ecology and living in balance with nature and so on. And they're very big on conservation. So there was one about save the sound, another about saving a river nearby, and things like that. So that was the practical piece. I like these things to have a ripple out into the world. So we're not just having our own private spiritual experience, which is good, and that's fine. But for it to actually have some impact in the world is what I try to do with, for example, with the labyrinth work that I do. So then I think his words will speak for himself. but he's a teacher. I learned about him through Matthew Fox, actually, who some people may know. He's kind of a radical post-Christian guy. He was a priest and he was defrocked because he preferred the feminine pronouns for God of she and her, because he felt it was arbitrary to refer to God as he and him. He just wanted to kind of shift the emphasis a little bit. And he was rebellious. He wasn't following all the doctrines of the Catholic Church. So now he's an Episcopal priest, and he can teach his teachings about the divine feminine. I tried to have him brought to the Mercy Center in this area, and they said, "Oh no, we can't do that. He's excommunicated." You know, so he's kind of a controversial figure, but I really like him. I've read a lot of his books, and he has a center in New York, and he does a lot at St. John the Divine. So he's kind of a radicalized, I guess, post-Christian thinker and author and teacher. And they're doing a lot of webinars now about sacred activism and trainings. We almost signed up a couple of years ago or a year ago, but we haven't done it, but I would like to. And his books and teachings are very available. And he's very accessible. And he has a lot of YouTube videos. So I just say, you know, check him out. But he's a radical mystic. But he talks about the importance of being grounded in action, being grounded in commitment to justice. So was this your turn, or?
Yeah, I'm just gonna, summarize what he meant by sacred activism, which is a spirituality that is only private and self-absorbed, one devoid of any authentic political and social consciousness, does little to halt the suicidal juggernaut of history. On the other hand, an activism that is not purified by profound spiritual and psychological self-awareness and rooted in divine truth, wisdom, and compassion will only perpetuate the problem it's trying to solve, however righteous its intentions. When, however, the deepest and most grounded spiritual vision is married to a practical and pragmatic drive to transform all existing political, economic, and social institutions, a holy force, the power of wisdom and love in action, is born, and this force I define as sacred activism. So he's arguing for spirituality to be an integral part of daily life, not to have it be something, oh, it's Sunday, so I'm going to go off to church, and that takes care of the spirituality for the week. But it's there every day of the week. Let me just see what we got here. There's a bunch of quotes that we have here. The one that I always liked was taken from Some Enchanted Evening from South Pacific, which is, "Fools give you answers, but wise men never try." And the Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, who was an incredible theoretician, he said, you yourself are the easiest one to fool with all of these theories and so forth. So there's a number of things like this. The reason why string theory is taken so seriously is because it's so crazy, but it looks like it's crazy enough to explain what's going on in actual modern physics understanding. But it's the problem that you have here, that Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate, said was, our mistake is not that we take your theories too seriously, we don't take them seriously enough. And it's hard to believe that these equations and everything else actually have anything to do with the real world around you. So here we have just again a bunch of other quotes. Again, Richard Feynman is in the bottom left corner. The real glory of science is we find a way of thinking such that the law is evident. That's usually after the fact. It's not before the fact, you know. Or Albert Einstein was once asked how it felt to be the smartest man alive, and Einstein replied, "I don't know. You'll have to ask Nikola Tesla." So, or we have David Bohm, who actually was a great theoretical physicist, and he concluded that Western science was not going to find answers to advanced physics, and he became highly mystical and looked to the East to try and understand what's going on. And then there's many of these pictures here from all kinds of things. Here's the Bhagavad Gita. Here's a Native American shaman. You know, here's probably, this is Nostradamus here. You know, all of these things just show that mysticism, you know, has been there forever, and it has been an integral part of life for many people.
What I love about science is that it raises more and more questions, and it just really evokes a mystery to me, and it shows this order that, you know, seems to be there by design. I'm not saying that means that some clockmaker, you know, created this little machine that is all organized, but that just brings out more and more of the mystery to me. It just brings out more and more questions, which I just love.
You know, I just view it as our ignorance is on a higher level. But we have a new vocabulary that expands our ignorance, but we don't get to the answers.
The new questions. Right?
Yeah. Here's some suggested reading in the area of, we're talking about Jung and Pauli had this dialogue. The PowerPoint obviously did me in. It's the book that's out there is Atom and Archetype. So Pauli was a theoretical physicist. He's handling the atom, and Jung is handling archetype. Jung argues that we ourselves are multiple archetypes, and that is how we interpret things. And so these letters that they carried out from 1932 to 1958 summarize this interaction between them. There's a totally separate book by a mathematician, Ian Stewart, called Why Beauty is Truth, the Nature of Symmetry. And we're going to go spend time on symmetry here because I think it's a useful way to comprehend a lot of these different ideas without going into incredible mathematical gyrations. The course actually started when you want to talk about this?
Either you can or I can.
Go, yeah, why don't you?
Okay. Well, we in our initial dialogues, we learned that we had like 4 really seminal books in common that were extremely life-changing for both of us. And I've never met anybody that's read, like, say, 2 of them, let alone all of them. And one of them was the Tao of Physics, which is just a wonderful look at the intersection between ancient mysticism and modern physics. And Bart has been in touch with this Fritjof Capra's staff. He hasn't been able to get directly in touch with him, but he's aware of us and what we're doing. But it's very much exactly what we're talking about. And this is a book that we both read decades ago. You were in graduate school when you first read it?
Yeah, or just, I think it came out in 75, but he was arguing that physics has hit a dead end, and that we need new ideas. And it looks like there's a lot of interesting ideas from the East, the Tao, that we ought to explore. Of course, his reward for doing this was he was blackballed by all the mainstream physicists, but
Right.
so it goes.
And this is a wonderful book that I brought to the table, Young, Synchronicity and Human Destiny by Ira Progoff. And the whole second chapter is devoted to astrology as an example of synchronicity. And I'm an astrologer who doesn't believe it's, but my notions of causality are changing since having more dialogues with Bart. But I've always seen astrology as describing a synchronistic reality rather than a causal reality, but still being worthwhile, but in a transformational way rather than a predictive way. And another book that we both read and fell in love with many years ago is called On Growth and Form. And this is just a fabulous book to own. It's just loaded with diagrams and beautifully written. And it's another view of evolution. It's not a Darwinian view of evolution. They were around the same time, they overlapped. He came a little bit after, and he sees it in more in terms of physics and mathematics than a theological explanation of Darwin's theory is really kind of creationist. You know, if you look at it, it's a different kind of understanding. It's a more mystical understanding of creation, I would say, and that things evolved the way they did out of necessity. And things just seem to grow in these spiral forms, whether it's a galaxy or a solar system or a shell or the horn of a ram. And it's like a kind of mathematical necessity. That's really interesting if you look at it. I wrote an essay, and that's on the resource page, about this in, I think it was 2002, that changed my life. I was really glad I was selected to write this for an academic publisher. And the assignment had been given to a friend of mine. He said, I can't make heads or tails of this. I was copy editing for the same publisher. It was an academic publisher. He said, well, I bet Marjorie Parch could write something. So they gave me a chance to write, which I really preferred over copy editing anyway. And I sent it to Bart. I said, you know, have you ever seen this guy's work? And Bart sent back like 10 examples of people that their work stemmed from his work. It was derivative.
Right.
But
It was a very seminal work.
right.
Marjorie, how is survival of the fittest, how does that equate with creationism?
I would say survival of the fittest is that's an oversimplification, really, of what's going on, or really of what Darwin said. And the mutations sometimes serve a purpose and sometimes they don't, that we're aware of. And there are huge leaps. You know, we don't have, they're not all filled in, you know, between, you know, let's say apes and humans. We don't know what that turning point was, what that transition was. There's no fossil evidence. And it seems like there would be. They say that, you know, the record is silent on that. So there are a lot of assumptions behind what we think of as an oversimplification of even of what Darwin was saying, which is a lot more simplistic than what Darcy Thompson was saying. And he would say they're not mutually exclusive at all. He was saying that creation worked through evolution, which is simply more of a process of creation that had happened over time through a mutation process.
Well, evolution, one who believes in creationism can readily believe that evolution is a component part of that creation.
Right.
But if you believe in evolution, I don't find how you follow that back to, therefore, there was a creator. I think, I can't connect those dots.
Well, then I would like to assign you, Stephen, to read my paper. It's just about 30 pages, okay? And it's very accessible. Anybody can read it, and it's on. We can send out a link with our follow-up. We usually do something Wednesday night or Thursday to follow up. We'll send you a link directly to it to just get a taste of what Thompson is saying. He was a mathematician, a classicist, and a naturalist. And what he's saying is very complicated and deep.
Yeah, Steve, one of the issues you face here is the following, that probably for 1 billion years, there were single-celled entities called bacteria or prokaryotes that existed on the face of the earth. And somehow these things got combined and created multi-celled creatures, which we call eukaryotes, which then triggered what you would call evolution. The only question is, if they were there for 1 billion years, why in the world did they combine? There's an act of creation there. No one can explain it.
And we're not saying that the creator is, the analogy often used is a cow herder, culling his herds, or a puppet maker making his puppets. It's not that simple. It's more about the principles and patterns. That's what I liked so much about Darcy Wentworth Thompson's book, was the way he looks at, he was fascinated by the Fibonacci sequence. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. And how prevalent that is in nature. It's almost universal, or another species of spiral, we could say. As we talked about in one class, the spiral that describes our solar system is a little bit different. That's another popular spiral form. But things aren't just this random chaos. I used to think the way the leaves grow on the stem of a plant was just totally chaotic. But if you look at the math in a spiral around the stem, there's an interval there, there's a pattern. If you look at them just from the side growing up, it looks like random variations. But even the apparent random variations, he would talk about things being a culmination of forces. So a bird's leg is hollow so that the bone doesn't weigh down the bird so much that it can't fly, but then it has to withstand the air pressure enough to and the gravity, standing on the earth, it has to be thick enough to bear the weight of the bird. So how is that worked out? It's incredibly ratioed. There's ratios for all of that, about the length of the joint, or the segment of the leg, and the diameter of the bone, and the thickness of the bone. It's all interrelated in this incredibly intricate mathematical way. Does that mean that somebody sat there with a slide rule and a protractor working it out? I'm not saying that, but it just enhances for me the mystery that there's so much order, there's so much organization.
One of the things that I've explored, Stephen, the golden spiral, and
Yes.
also fractals. And if you explore those two, mathematical and physical conjunctions. You'll find some rare beauty, as well as maybe a universality, as well as maybe a godlike implementation in the whole process.
Yes. That I find the more I look at it, the more enamored I am of looking at it, because it just evokes this beauty and reason and it gives me this feeling of awe and gratitude that it just never pales for me. And just to contemplate the mystery, I think, is uplifting in itself. Without saying somebody sat there with a slide rule and a protractor and worked it all out, but it is worked out in some way. I would say as much by the laws of gravity and air pressure and everything else. The growth of the organism is exerting a force itself against gravity, things like that.
My take on it is that because of all that we've just been hearing, you've been talking about, that lends itself to a perspective of intelligent design slash deity having created all of this incredibly marvelous, beautiful, etc. Universe that we're in. And my take is that, I have a limited intelligence, I have a limited education, I have a limited experience, etc. And based on my limitations, I can't come up with any answer that is superior to intelligent design. But that does not lead me to just necessarily believe that that's the case. I think, okay, it could be the case, but it could be something else that I'm just not smart enough to recognize. And
Well, I would say that's where Thompson leaves us too. And he doesn't like this notion of teleology, that everything is always aspiring toward perfection, and that's the divine order. It is more chaotic than that, but as you're saying, our perception is also very limited. But the more deeply you look, the more order that you see. Just looking at that spiral on the cover of the book, each cell is double the size of the previous one. And that's part of what makes the order. And you can also describe that numerically. I forget exactly what it is. 1, 3, 5.
So
1,
that's
2,
a Fibonacci,
3.
but this is going to be
Yeah.
your golden ratio here,
Okay.
which comes out of that. Yeah.
Right.
Do you want to do Hamlet's Mill?
Well, or should we close? Have 4 minutes to close? Hamlet's Mill is another wonderful book. It's somewhat controversial. It's like Joseph Campbell on steroids. He's talking about the origins of basically all the myths of all the cultures, describing patterns and relationships in our solar system and constellations as backdrops to those. This is another book that Bart and I both read many, many years ago. So to have all, 3 of these, that's why we decided to do the class, because we'd never met anybody else that had read all of these. And here I am, an astrologer and a publishing, surf in New York for my day job, and sometimes some writing, that was a treat to write about on growth and form. And Bart's a mathematician, really functioning as a physicist at AT&T. And yet we had these really deep, deep books in common. And this is a classic. it's about this thick. Do we have a copy here?
Not right here.
It must be behind us,
Yeah.
but it's it's just well, we could talk about the title. Myth is Hamlet's Mill. It's talking about, they're usually about cycles that are very, very regular. And that's really where the story of Hamlet comes from, that Shakespeare worked with. It was a traditional story. It was, it was like a legend, almost like a fairy tale. And it could be said to describe the turning of the clockwork of the patterns of the cycles, let's say, between Jupiter and Saturn, and how they will intersect at times and then separate, and then there's all these intervals where they intersect again. The ancients knew this in unbelievable detail. And so it's thought that the myths were mnemonic devices to memorize and teach these patterns, just incredible patterns that they, determined watching the night sky. They didn't have TV, they didn't have internet. They watched the night sky and they recorded measurements and they passed them on from generation to generation. So the cycle of Jupiter takes about 12 years and the cycle of Saturn takes about 30 years. So they're going to come together at points, and then Jupiter will move ahead because it's going faster, and Saturn will at different intervals catch up, and that pattern makes a design that looks like a 12-pointed star. And you'll see that pattern in things. You'll see it in art and in tapestries. People knew it. People do that pattern. And the myths tell the stories that help you remember the pattern. So this for me was just absolutely mind-blowing. And I was probably in my early 30s when I read it.
So
to be continued, and we'll send you a link to the book itself. It's available on Amazon. It's got a Wikipedia page. Sometimes it's disparaged. There are people who really put it down. I think it's very threatening to a lot of people. And then you can see my essay and how I was influenced by it, and what I was already thinking when I wrote the essay. I was in my early 40s. I'm in my early 60s now. But it was very life-changing for me. Was it life-changing for you?
yeah, it was these are really new ideas that I'd never come across, and the exposition was outstanding and the amount of data that they gathered to make their case was huge. Well, why are these people, building these pyramids or building these stone circles or looking up at the stars? Don't they have anything else to do? Aren't they trying to simply live, get enough food every day? But they thought this was important. What was it?
This was written by two scholars that were actually at MIT, which is where Bart hails from.
Yeah. So we're gonna break here, hour and a half. We'll send out a recording, and just trying to think.
Bart, why did they do it?
That's your homework, Steve.
Yes, that's your assignment.
You have to figure that out. But for now,
This is why I go back and forth. Yes, especially my father.